Margaret had always believed that a person's true character revealed itself in the smallest moments, and on this particular Tuesday afternoon in late September, she was about to witness a moment that would prove this belief more powerfully than she could have imagined. She sat in the corner booth of Danny's diner, and her hands rested gently on her rounded belly, where her daughter moved and kicked with increasing frequency these days. And at 7 months pregnant, Margaret had developed a certain patience with the world around her, though she had never been the type to seek confrontation or drama. The diner had been a fixture in their small town for nearly 40 years, and Margaret remembered coming here as a young girl with her own mother ordering chocolate milkshakes and grilled cheese sandwiches. And now, decades later, the black and white checkered floor still gleamed under the afternoon sun that streamed through the large windows, and the red vinyl booths still held that familiar comfort of home. Her husband, Thomas, was due to arrive any moment, and she smiled thinking of him out on the highway with his motorcycle club. And they were good men, despite what some people assumed when they saw the leather jackets and the rumble of their bikes, and Thomas had the gentlest soul of anyone she had ever known. And he treated her like precious china, even though she had always been strong and independent. A young waiter approached her table, and he couldn't have been more than 22 or 23, with sandy hair and a nervous energy that suggested this might be one of his first jobs, and Margaret recognized that uncertainty, having raised 3 sons who had each stumbled through their early working years with varying degrees of success. "Can I get you something while you wait?" he asked, and his voice cracked slightly with what seemed like impatience rather than nerves. Margaret smiled warmly at him and ordered a glass of water and some crackers to settle her stomach, and the morning sickness had mostly passed, but certain smells still bothered her, and she had learned to be cautious about what she ate and when. The young man nodded curtly and walked away without the usual pleasantries that the other staff members offered, and Margaret noticed but didn't think much of it, because everyone had difficult days, and perhaps he was dealing with troubles of his own. When he returned, he placed the water glass down with more force than necessary, and some of the liquid sloshed onto the table, and Margaret reached for a napkin to clean it up. But before she could, the waiter made a sound of disgust. "You people always make such a mess," he muttered, and Margaret looked up, surprised by the hostility in his voice. "Excuse me," she said gently, thinking perhaps she had misheard him. The young waiter's face had turned red, and something in his expression suggested a deeper anger that had nothing to do with spilled water, and he glanced at her pregnant belly with what could only be described as contempt. "Women like you," he said, and his voice rose slightly, "coming in here expecting special treatment just because you couldn't be bothered to plan your life properly, and now the rest of us have to deal with it." Margaret felt her face flush, and not from embarrassment but from the shock of such unexpected cruelty. And she had encountered judgment before during this unexpected late-in-life pregnancy, but never such open hostility, and certainly never from someone whose job required basic courtesy. "Young man," she began, and her voice remained steady despite her racing heart, "I think you might be having a difficult day, but there's no call for that kind of talk." This seemed to inflame him further, and before Margaret could process what was happening, the waiter picked up the water glass and threw its contents directly at her, and the cold water hit her face and chest and soaked into her burgundy jacket and white blouse beneath. Diner fell silent, and every conversation stopped mid-sentence, and every fork paused halfway to every mouth. And Margaret sat there dripping and stunned, while the young waiter seemed suddenly uncertain, as if he couldn't quite believe what he had just done. An older waitress named Helen rushed over with a stack of towels, and her face showed both horror and compassion. And she had worked at Danny's for over 20 years and had served Margaret's family countless times. "Honey," Helen said, and her voice trembled with emotion, "I am so terribly sorry, and let me help you." Margaret took the towels with shaking hands and began to dry her face while trying to process what had just happened, and she wasn't angry so much as deeply sad that someone so young carried such bitterness inside them. The manager appeared from the kitchen, and a middle-aged man named Frank, who had gone to high school with Margaret's oldest brother, and his face showed the kind of fury that comes from witnessing something truly unacceptable. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Frank demanded of the young waiter, who now stood frozen with his face pale and his hands trembling. The waiter started, but seemed unable to finish his sentence. because there was no justification for what he had done, and even he seemed to realize this. Frank turned to Margaret with genuine distress in his eyes and, "Margaret, I cannot apologize enough, and this is completely unacceptable, and I want you to know that this young man will not be working here any longer." Margaret looked at the waiter, who now seemed very young indeed and very frightened, and she saw in his face the kind of pain that often manifested as anger, and she didn't know his story or what had brought him to this point, but she recognized suffering when she saw it. "Frank," she said quietly, "let's not make any hasty decisions, and perhaps we could all just take a moment." But before Frank could respond, the door to the diner opened, and in walked Thomas, followed by 5 other members of his motorcycle club. And they still wore their leather jackets with the club insignia on the back, and their boots made solid sounds on the tile floor. Thomas saw Margaret immediately, and his expression shifted from relaxed contentment to alarm in a heartbeat, and he crossed the diner in quick strides, and his friends followed, and the young waiter seemed to shrink into himself. "Maggie," Thomas said, and his deep voice carried concern and tenderness. "What happened, and why are you wet?" Margaret reached for his hand, and, "It was an accident," she started to say, but Helen interrupted. "It was no accident." Helen said firmly. This young man threw water in her face, and deliberately, and for no reason at all. The atmosphere in the diner changed dramatically, and Thomas stood very still, in the kind of stillness that preceded action, and his friends positioned themselves around the booth, and their faces showed a protective anger that made the young waiter take a step backward. "Is this true?" Thomas asked, and his voice had gone quiet and dangerous. The waiter looked at the group of large men in leather jackets and seemed to realize the magnitude of his mistake, and his face had gone from pale to nearly gray, and he appeared ready to faint. Margaret stood up and placed herself between Thomas and the young waiter, and she put her hand on her husband's chest and felt his heart racing beneath her palm. "Thomas," she said gently, "look at me." Her husband's jaw was clenched, but he met her eyes, and she saw the fierce protectiveness there, mixed with love and anger on her behalf. "This young man made a mistake," Margaret said carefully, "and he's already terrified, and I think perhaps there's more to this story than what we're seeing." Thomas looked at her as if she had lost her mind, and, "Maggie, he threw water at you and at our baby, and you're 7 months pregnant." "I know," she said softly, "and it was wrong and hurtful, but look at him, Thomas, and really look." Thomas reluctantly turned his attention back to the waiter, who now had tears streaming down his face, and his whole body shook with what appeared to be fear and shame and grief all mixed together. "I'm sorry," the young man whispered. "I'm so sorry, and I don't know what came over me, and I just—" His voice broke completely. Margaret felt her own eyes fill with tears, and pregnancy had made her more emotional. But this wasn't just hormones, and this was recognition of genuine human pain. "What's your name?" she asked the waiter gently. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand like a child might, and, "Jason," he said quietly. "Jason," Margaret repeated. "Why don't you sit down and tell us what's really going on?" Frank started to protest, and, "Margaret, he assaulted you, and we should call the police." But Margaret shook her head, and, "I don't want to call the police, and I want to understand." Thomas looked at his wife with an expression that mixed exasperation with admiration, and he had always said she had the biggest heart of anyone he knew, and sometimes that worried him, but he trusted her judgment, even when he didn't fully understand it. Jason sank into the booth across from where Margaret had been sitting, and he put his head in his hands, and his shoulders shook with silent sobs, and the diner remained quiet. And everyone watching this unexpected drama unfold. Margaret sat back down, and Thomas slid in beside her, and his arm went protectively around her shoulders, and his friends maintained their positions nearby, but their expressions had shifted from anger to curiosity. "Take your time," Margaret said to Jason, "but I think you need to tell us what's happening in your life." Jason took several shaky breaths before he could speak, and when he did, his voice was barely audible, and, "My girlfriend was pregnant," he said, "and we were going to get married, and I was working 2 jobs to save up for an apartment and for the baby. He paused and wiped his eyes again, and she was 7 months along and just like you, and we were so happy and scared but happy. And then 3 weeks ago, she went into early labor. Margaret felt her breath catch, and she already knew where.